As I take a deep breath, about to start, more people come in, but let's make a start. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on Henry VIII. It's great to see some familiar faces in the list of attendees. So if you're coming back to us, thank you so much. We appreciate having you with us. If you're new to us, just to outline how this works, I have the pleasure of being in conversation with a colleague who has worked on this particular play. We talk for about perhaps 45 minutes, something like that, 50 minutes. And then we've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've got a 75-minute slot. So if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll keep an eye on those as we go through in case we can take them as we go. We find that people really warm up with questions, so if you can get your question in early, probably it's more likely to be answered. So do that as we go along. My name's Emma Smith. I'm here at Oxford, where I'm beaming from. Beaming in every sense of the word. And I'm delighted to be in conversation with Laura Jayne Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone else.
Yeah, it's really, really great to be having this conversation. So just as we always say, these are we're talking prompted by the publication of the New Oxford Shakespeare's diffusion line, as we might call it, into the Oxford World's Classics, into these individual books, beautifully designed. Here is Henry VIII. So we're particularly grateful to the New Oxford Shakespeare team, to Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boris, and Gabriel Egan, and particularly in the case of Henry VIII, to Will Sharp, who worked on that text for the New Oxford Shakespeare. So my job as the general editor has been to identify brilliant people who can do the work of introducing these plays to 21st century audiences. And I was really delighted that Laura agreed to do this play because of the work. I asked her because of the work she had done with Creation Theatre in thinking about its sort of stage worthiness. So Laura, tell us how you got into thinking about Henry VIII.
Absolutely. So I was already thinking about Henry VIII from one kind of very simple point, which was that I knew it was the play that was associated with a cannon misfiring and the burning down of the Globe Theatre. So because I was thinking about sound effects and I was thinking about sort of stage explosions and other sort of spectacular things, I thought I want to look at Henry VIII and think about it in performance. I approached Creation Theatre, who are a local troupe at the time. Were primarily working in kind of live in-person shows, and they had agreed to do a sort of research performance with me. So that was looking at the text, figuring out how to stage it. We had some really grand ideas that we were going to perform certain bits of it, maybe in colleges or pubs around the city. We were going to have really fancy costumes, and we were going to really lean into the kind of spectacle, the richness, the lavishness of this play. Then the pandemic hit, and so we pivoted and we started to think about what it would mean to read this play, to perform it as a kind of I suppose, a kind of performed read along hybrid on Zoom, and that's what we ended up doing. So it was a kind of constantly shifting collaboration between me and creation.
I remember it as one of those incredibly creative, sort of slightly improvised, all working out how the online space worked, elements of lockdown, which was a terrible time and traumatic time in also many ways for so many people, and also had these glimmers of community and different ways of doing things, of which I think the Henry VIII was absolutely one. Okay, so this is a play, I'm guessing. I mean, we've got some brilliantly committed Shakespeareans on this webinar. One of the things that's been great about them is the way they attract interested people who know a great deal or know a bit or know some things, but not this one. I'm guessing that Henry VIII might be at the far end of many people's familiarity with Shakespeare. So let's just start with where the play comes in Shakespeare's career and what part of the plot you would like to bring out.
So it's a relatively late play for Shakespeare, and I should say co-authored with John Fletcher. So what they are sort of negotiating in this play is which piece of that really famous historical moment to play with. So people are usually really familiar with the Tudors. Obviously, a lot of people are very familiar with Shakespeare. It's surprising how few are familiar with the two together in Henry VIII. What Shakespeare and Fletcher are thinking about is the sort of, I suppose you could say, child crisis of the play. So we've got Henry, who has long since been married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon unable to give Henry the living male heir that he desires, and the divorce, as the play puts it, that triggers the eventual need to break from Rome, so that Henry can marry Anne. So it's a incredibly sort of fraught moment in history that is a sort of turning point in the road. It's a fork after which nothing is quite the same. And the play decides to look at that moment and end precisely with the birth of the baby that will be Elizabeth I. So it makes very sort of sharp choices in terms of what history it looks at to frame Henry VIII's life as a kind of prologue to Elizabeth's.
Hmm. That's such a great point about the framing, which is always such an issue in carving out. I mean, it's an issue in any play, of course, framing the narrative and the genre and so on. But in histories, it's really pronounced, isn't it? What do you choose? Where do you choose to start and finish? And what does that say about the story you want to tell? How do you feel? People probably will be familiar with a lot of other Henry plays from 10, 15 years earlier in Shakespeare's solo career. Um, do you feel, is it useful to think about this play in relation to those earlier histories, or does it feel a completely different beast?
So, yes and no is the answer. So, I mean, yes, in that it's sort of fascinating that, again, we have a play centered around a sort of one powerful, robust monarch. We might think about Henry V as a sort of parallel. But at the same time, we have a kind of introspection that Henry VIII occasionally gives us, which is, I suppose, a little bit more maybe kind of Richard III, this idea of a monarch who's in turmoil, who doesn't know which way to choose. But in terms of structure and in terms of genre, it's quite markedly different from those earlier history plays that people might be more familiar with. We've got a much more sort of reflective way of writing. It's a bit more kind of elliptical and complicated in that romance style that we associate a bit more with Shakespeare's later career. We also have a real sense of regret and sorrow and mistakes that are teased out much more in this play than I might say in the earlier histories. So actually, a lot of this play is about how will we be remembered? Will we be remembered? Are our actions just obsolete? Or actually, do the tiny decisions we make every day change the course of history? It's sometimes called a play of falling stars. So it's basically a play that introduces these incredibly famous figures from history and then just bats them aside in a way that means in some ways it's a bit more of a sort of spread cast in terms of performance. Yes, we have Henry VIII, but we also have interest in Wolsey, interest in Catherine of Aragon, and in their inner lives.
Hmm. It, there's a bit in your introduction which I really enjoyed rereading over the weekend, where you point out that in the alternative title, so this is a play We had a bit of an argument about this, I think, didn't we, as well, on the for the World's Classics edition. Should this play be called All Is True, which seems, I think, to be the reference when the globe burns down. It's
Hmm.
the performance is All Is True, isn't it? So it feels as if that's the title by which it's known, maybe in its first performances, but then published in the Folio as Henry VIII. Um, there's a great bit in your introduction where you talk about the way these alternative titles give us both the sort of great man theory of history and a much slyer, more sort of ironic sense. It's hard to imagine delivering the phrase "all is true" about history without a knowing wink or something. Is is it quite self-conscious, do you feel?
There's a lot of moments in the play where it is kind of explicitly talking about the sense of not just truth, but sort of historical accuracy of narratives that can't contradict each other. There are a lot of tiny mentions that you might, at first glance, not even really pay attention to about old folk tales, about I suppose, myths or kind of ways of remembering, and the whole play is constantly reflecting on that. So there is a sense that the play is constantly inviting its audience to keep putting pressure on what it's telling you. There are also scenes that contradict each other. So we get several trial scenes, whether that's a formal kind of trial where Catherine of Aragon is kind of fighting for her right to remain queen, or whether it's more of a kind of debate about someone's value. But those scenes often carefully show us both points of view, and those both points of view are often very plausible. So again, we're getting this sense that what we know about that period is partly murky and contradictory, but partly very much shaped by what ultimately Henry VIII chooses to do. So we also do have this sense that there is a sort of powerful figure at the center of this who makes truth, who decides which bits of his world are true. And I
Mm.
think that's quite arresting and quite,
That's a really chilling. That's
yeah.
actually a really chilling thought. I, I've got a really silly question in a way. I mean, I feel embarrassed because it seems a very unsophisticated question. But it seems this is a play which dramatizes, um, as you pointed out, this extraordinary seismic shift in England's relationship to the church, and it dramatizes, this question that all those Tudor fictions are sort of preoccupied with, from, well, I suppose from this one to Hilary Mantel or whatever, which is, is Henry right to divorce? Is Anne Boleyn, is it right for him to marry her? Is it however you sort of justify rightness? Do, I can't tell what the play thinks about that. It feels as if the play ought to take a view.
Mhm.
Catherine of Aragon, you know, shriveled up old Catholic, can't, Anne Boleyn, feisty, juicy young. It ought to somehow. I feel as if it should know. We should know what it thinks about this, and I feel as if somehow we don't.
Yes, I totally agree, and it's more obvious if you watch the play, and you're able to kind of see the absence of Anne Boleyn. So sometimes in the act of reading, it's a little bit more difficult to keep track of who's where. But if you watch, you'll see actually Anne Boleyn kind of bursts onto the scene in a party scene in which she says next to nothing, and lots of people basically just comment on how attractive she is. She then has one intimate scene with an old woman, a kind of nursemaid or servant, where she uh, either denies wanting anything to do with being queen, or if we read it ironically, shows herself to be this kind of scheming, manipulative woman who's desperate to be queen. So that scene pushes us in two possible directions. And then in the moment when she should sort of appear in triumph, which is she's finally given Henry this heir, a female heir, Elizabeth I, but nonetheless an heir. She's not there at the coronation. She's not there at the christening. Sorry, she's not there at the end of the play. So we have this real sense that whatever value she had is the play is no longer interested in her. And this is a play with very precise stage directions. This isn't a play that would sort of just vaguely mean, oh, have Anne in the background. If she's not listed amongst many, many kind of minor nobles who are given a role in the play, then she's really not meant to be there. So Anne is complicated, and it's hard to see any real praise for her, even though she is Elizabeth's mother. So James, who is James the First, who's on the throne at this point, claims his right to the throne through Elizabeth. So that's a bit complicated. Catherine, on the other hand, is this powerhouse, this incredible, articulate, ferocious, unrelenting, unapologetic character who asserts till the end that she is queen. She's the daughter of a king, but she's also the wife of a king. She is not changing that perspective. And as you say, she's Catholic, she's Spanish, she's unable to perform the kind of act of motherhood, which is the kind of definition of her role as queen. And yet the play refuses to diminish her, even at its very last sort of Catherine moment of the play. She has this incredible vision that seems to suggest her access to a sort of spiritual world that the likes of Henry can't possibly understand. So, yeah, it's not a play that's willing to answer that question, Emma. So it's not you not seeing the answer, it's that the play is willfully not giving you it.
And do you think that is that carefulness, do you think, on the part of the Shakespeare Fletcher duo? Is that a sense that this is still unfinished or sort of open business that's a bit dangerous to come close to? Or is it, I don't know, a more existential point, do you think, about how
Well, I think
history gets told? Yeah.
you have got two co-authors perhaps pulling in slightly different directions. I mean, there's always a sense of collaboration that maybe, not every moment matches. But I think more than that, the play is basically trying to show a moment where there isn't really a right answer. I mean, Henry is obliged to produce an heir in order to avoid a kind of reversion to the civil war that his father had taken part in. The way he does it is through a real sort of legal loophole, right?
Mm,
And the play calls the separation of Henry and Catherine a divorce, which I think is quite telling because technically it's an annulment. So what happens is Henry says that his marriage to Catherine was never valid. And he gets scholars of the law and of the church to kind of prove that. But the play calls it a divorce because the play kind of dismisses that loophole and says, look,
mm,
what happened is the marriage was broken up. Henry decided to end that marriage
mm.
and start another one. So I do think the play is very self-consciously teasing out these ideas, but I also think it's a really controversial thing to be writing about. What you're having to do is you want to show Catherine to be this sort of powerful historical figure, but not praise her too much as a sort of Catholic
Mm.
figure, and sort of negotiate a lingering sense maybe of Anne Boleyn as a sort of a femme fatale. I mean, this is someone who was executed for her behavior and for her betrayal and the talk of witchcraft and treason and all this. So again, not a figure you can really praise on stage, but at the same time, a figure who is Elizabeth I's mother 10 years after Elizabeth has been on the throne. So there's a lot of moving parts to negotiate, I think, and it does make it a
Mm.
bit uneven, but also really fascinating.
I don't want to lose that, Catherine's vision, which I think is so interesting. I want to ask you about, but just not still on this just point about sort of contemporary politics and how they might play in. So the play, sometimes I've seen this play talked about in the context of the end of the political honeymoon the English feel for James. So as I understand that narrative, and you'll correct me, or somebody on somebody here will correct me, there's a feeling that by the end of Elizabeth's reign, everybody's fed up with her. She's been around too long. It's somehow that there's a vice-like grip on all the offices of state and all of that stuff. There's a feeling we need something different. And so there's a lot of positive energy about James and James having all his children sort of set up in the succession and all of those things. And that sours a little bit because of James's personality or policies or whatever, and that we start to get the I don't know if this is absolutely right. I'm saying it very confidently, aren't I? As if it is that we start to get the invention or the elevation of Elizabeth as this great Virgin Queen, wonderfully. I feel as if that's when the Tilbury speech, about the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. I think that's first published then, isn't it? And possibly even written then. It might not have been actually what she said at the Spanish Armada, but it's part of that posthumous elevation of her, which is itself slightly anti-James, or not anti-James is too much, but disappointed in James. So do you think James has a role? How is James sort of implicated in this play or in its reception?
It is interesting because there is a sort of nostalgia, I think, for what seemed to be a sort of it's easy to look back at that Elizabethan moment with kind of maybe more patriotic eyes, right? So there is a nostalgia, certainly a nostalgia for the past in the play. I don't know whether that's specifically for Elizabeth, but certainly Henry VIII looks back very fondly at his father's reign. There's a sense that people tend to believe that the past was simpler and more valorous and more honourable,
Yeah.
and that whatever the modern moment is somehow, more morally corrupt and more difficult. So that's all through the play, and certainly by choosing to end the play, not just with the sort of christening of Elizabeth, but with this prophetic speech. So what happens is Cranmer looks forward not just to Elizabeth's reign and to all the kind of mighty and wonderful things that she'll do, but also to the heir that she'll leave behind, and that's James. So the play, and I should clarify, that's not because Elizabeth gives birth to James. That's because he's next in her line of succession. But nonetheless, she sort of facilitates the rise of the Jacobean power. So the play is bringing itself right up to its present moment. It's a history play, but the last words in the play are, connecting the past and the present perfectly. So there is a sense that everything that's happened before has led to James. And in that sense, that puts both praise and pressure on James. So there is a sense that, yes, all of this has led to him, but also is he living up to this historical past and to all of this upheaval, all of these machinations, all of this work, all of this disruption with the church? Is James a worthy result for all
Mm,
of that?
mm.
Is that something that, the play is willing to commit to? I'm not too sure.
And
Uh,
there's one other historical thing that you write about so interestingly, which is Prince Henry. So
right.
James's oldest son, Prince Henry, who is thought to be the great chivalric hope, and the sort of inheritor of his ancestors
Mm.
somehow. He dies in 1613. Do Is that right?
No, yes, go on.
Yeah, sorry, sorry. I was just thinking. So, do we know that the play is before or after that?
So the performance, as we know it, will be after. We don't know whether we imagine it's written before his death, just in terms of the timing of how long it takes to produce a
Mm,
play. But it's difficult to know precisely because there's such a massive instantaneous kind of literary output at the
mm,
death of Prince Henry. So people are rapidly writing, eulogies and sonnets and expressions of sorrow. They're publishing these basically overnight sermons and
mm,
speeches, and so it's possible that that is sort of infecting the
mm,
play in its kind of in last moments. But certainly by the time it's being performed, so I'm thinking of when it's performed at the Globe and the Globe burns down in the summer of 1613. That death is in the air. People are responding to the loss of Prince Henry, but also to the loss of um, an imagined future. So Henry is, as you said, he's chivalric. He styles himself as very martial. He is going to get involved in European conflict. He is going to make a more of a name for England. But he's also very, very Protestant, very devout. So the play is it's interesting which religious direction the country should be going in. It does have one eye on a future where the next Henry, the Henry who would have been Henry the Ninth, is determined to make it a Protestant nation. And obviously, the play's own hesitance about what history will bring and how it'll be recorded is kind of mirrored in this real life event where what was going to happen suddenly isn't. And so we're watching the play in the background of that loss. For some people, I suppose that might even have seemed like a positive thing. Not everyone was on board with Henry's policies. Um, but yes, losing Henry as a kind of heir is definitely in the air, as it were,
Yeah.
when we're watching this play.
It's such a fork in the road moment, isn't it? Thinking what happens under Henry's younger brother, that Charles becomes king, Charles rather than the intended heir Henry, and all that happens then. It's a great what if sort of moment, isn't it? That's really also fascinating. The thing I wanted to go back to was Catherine. I want to talk a little bit about spectacle and the amazing sort of set pieces in the play. Not, I think, in the way that some previous criticism dismissed it really as if it was only these sort of set pieces. And I think only is just such a wrong way to think about them. But I was thinking particularly about Catherine's vision of the heavenly sort of host. She's dreaming and she sees this extraordinarily lavish vision. It's so unusual for Shakespeare or with Fletcher to imagine an afterlife really.
Mm.
And it's so striking that it's so beautiful and so Catholic. Uh, and I guess a lot of those figures in that procession are then reattired for the Chris, for later sort of moments of pageantry in the play. Um, either about pageantry in general or that one of Catherine's in particular. What do you think they are doing in performance? What are they conveying by their lavishness?
Well, some directors have, as you said, made these sort of big set pieces connected so that, using the same choreography for a dance that might mark Anne's coronation and Elizabeth's christening, reusing costumes. Some productions have made a real selling point of the historical accuracy. These will be perfect, beautiful Tudor costumes and sort of put emphasis on what we're seeing. And that is important in that the language of the play is often interested in surfaces, in gold versus glitter, in the value of what we see and in how power is established through ceremony, how actually that is used to assert who's in charge and who has wealth and so on. But then we have Catherine's vision, which is in many ways just as much of a spectacle but is much more complicated. So Catherine falls asleep. She then sees what appears to be a kind of divine blessing, right? So if we take seriously that Catherine is having a real vision in her sleep, then what it appears the play is saying is that she is actually blessed. She is given a kind of heavenly crown, and that God or her sort of religious framework certainly had said that she's done the right thing. She has always been a queen. She dies knowing that she's still favored. On the other hand, of course, we can think of this as just a dream. Perhaps this is just something that she imagines as she comes to the end of her life. We're not sure what the source is, but certainly what we have is this sort of pseudo coronation, right? We have her given a crown in a way that seems to suggest that the play is finally deciding that Catherine is the one in the right, for want of a better way to put it. And we have a lot of sort of Catholic iconography in that scene as well. There's a real sense she's presented with a crown that several scholars have suggested is a sort of representative of her her chastity and her virtue and so on. So those moments are so important to what the play has to say about history that to dismiss them as just flashy, fun scenes where everyone troops on in their best costumes and then troops off again is very much to miss the point. That being said, that is part of the fun of the play. It is fascinating to see all the pomp and circumstance, and that is something that the play is really interested in staging. As I mentioned earlier, there are really, really long stage directions listing all the people who are crossing the stage, what they're carrying. Are they carrying maces? Do they have certain ceremonial garb on? It is kind of fascinated with that too. So watching it is really arresting in terms of that court world that we get to see.
I love that idea that that the whole play uh, is invested in the way that power isn't just represented, but is actually produced by that kind of um, that there's that kind of costume or that kind of demeanor, and that makes more sense of. I mean, I seem to remember in the letter we get um, describing the burning of the Globe. Isn't that when Henry Wotton says that the depiction of these historical figures on the stage had made them very degraded or something? I don't know whether that feels as if
Yeah.
that fits in a way with the very engaged snapshots this play gives us of courtly life.
He says it makes greatness familiar, and I think that's really interesting. So this idea that this performance of history somehow lessens it. We get too close. That's
Mm.
kind of what Wotton's saying. We see too much into this uh, courtly world, and we know too much about it.
Yeah.
And actors coming on stage dressed in all this garb, in some ways, kind of lessens the effect of real monarchs and real nobles wearing it. It sort of makes it seem like something one can just put on and take off again, which, of course, in reality, it is. I mean, certainly sort of seeing an actor strutting around wearing a crown may perhaps lessen the power that that crown has to signify that one sacred, sort of powerful man who wears it is kind of marked out by that signal. It is interesting that Wotton, who so yeah, he writes a letter basically describing what's happened during the fire, and in that we get this tiny little kind of description of the play itself. His response has been so far that it was about the sort of principal pieces. So he thinks it's about the kind of key scenes everyone would recognize, and that it's about pomp and circumstance. So he obviously doesn't get that far into the play before the fire starts and everything is called to a halt. But his initial sense of the play is that it's all spectacle and not really substance.
Hmm. Hmm. So we've talked quite a lot about the play and its attitude to histories of different sorts. I was thinking about the other genre that it's sometimes put in with because of where it comes in Shakespeare's writing is with those late plays in which men get a kind of redemption through daughters, the birth of daughters, don't they? So Prospero, I suppose, with Miranda, or maybe even more so Leontes with Perdita. How does it fit that romance genre? Is that a useful lens to look at the play?
Well, certainly in my introduction, I've talked about that a little bit because it
Mm,
helped me, I think, to think about whether the play can offer a sense of forgiveness. So I've said so far that it's interested in, the choices people make, in how history remembers us, in judgment and in truth. But actually, there is a space in this play as well, not just for nostalgia and memory and regret, but for there being a second chance, whether that's forgiveness for Henry or actually, as do remind me to sort of come back to, there's forgiveness for Catherine, maybe forgiveness for Wolsey. But for Henry, his success as a king seems to boil down to what Elizabeth will do. So he ends the play imagining himself in heaven. So we have another heavenly moment. We've just seen Catherine having this heavenly vision. Now we have Henry creating his own heavenly vision. He's in heaven, he's looking down, he's seeing Elizabeth be a successful monarch, and therefore his life and his choices are redeemed. So there's certainly that pattern there that we might associate with romance. As you said, we've got, Lear and Cordelia, we've got Pericles, these fathers who live on through their daughters' choices. It's also got another kind of marker of late plays or romance, I think, is a sort of willingness to think about obscurity, becoming obsolete, falling from one's position of power. So usually we get the father slowly coming to terms with maybe his own mortality or his own failures or his own, maybe say in the case of Lear, his own loss of status or who he used to be. We haven't quite got that with Henry. At the end of the play, he is still Henry. He's still in charge. He's still the king. He has a baby daughter. He's going to go on, as we know, to complete his sort of famous score of six wives.
Mm.
There's more history to come, and we know that. But there is this little moment at the end where he sort of seems to articulate, this is the thing I'll be remembered for. My daughter is the reason I'm here. But we have to take this with a pinch of salt because he has spent the whole play saying how rubbish it is to have a daughter and how he needs to have a son. And he even says in this last scene, now I have this fantastic daughter. But he already has a daughter. He already has
I was just going
Catherine's
to
daughter.
say, what's happened to Mary? So she's just completely airbrushed out of this
Yes.
view.
So she's mentioned in the play. She's not in the play. There is a mention of her. Catherine says when she's dying, take care of my daughter, remember me to my daughter, make sure that she's looked after. But the play basically shows Henry rewriting as he speaks. I mean, he's literally off the cuff, making up what history has happened, and he's saying, "I am Henry VIII, and I have this heir."
Mm.
And I sort of choose her. Of course, that's not what happens in the line of succession. Actually, when Henry dies, Mary comes to the throne. Um, it's not as simple as that. There's also no mention of the son he is going to have. So he's
Mhm.
going to have the baby who will be Edward VI. But the play doesn't allow for that either. It just sort of streamlines its view to focus on Elizabeth.
Mhm. Yes, it's so interesting to write a play set in this period if your aim is to simplify its messiness, isn't it? It reminds me of, I think, the pageant or the city entertainment when Elizabeth comes to the throne has a sort of living family tree of
Mm,
Elizabeth, and uh, it's sort of Henry VIII straight to her. That
mm,
it's all that bit, all that sort of trauma is just completely national trauma, religious trauma is just completely, yeah, airbrushed out of the historical record, and then we get instead this fantasy of
mhm.
succession, direct succession. Yeah, which is really interesting. Okay, so that generic piece is an interesting way to think about the shaping of Henry's character, um, or Henry's kind of character arc. Brilliant. I was thinking about in relation to Mary. In fact, right at the top of the questions, Mike asked about the Globe production in 2022, which I think is the version added to by Hannah, the playwright Hannah Khalil. And she did, you talk a bit about this in the introduction. I didn't see the performance, but I've read the text. She very interestingly, to my mind, and rather brilliantly, grafts in from other Shakespeare plays quite a lot of part for Mary. What did you think of that production in response to Mike's question?
So I really enjoyed that production, and I enjoyed its sort of, in some ways, by rewriting Henry VIII, you're engaging with exactly what Henry VIII is doing, which is rewriting its own sense of history. So what that production does is then say, okay, well, I'll take the bits that I like and I'll add the bits that I want and I'll change the narrative here. So we end up with play that is much more willing to foreground female characters, that is willing to challenge Henry's claim that Elizabeth is his obvious and sole heir, but also that is willing to piece together different plays. So as you said, there are lines borrowed from various different Shakespeare plays and then kind of welded together to make text where there wasn't text. And it's in that sort of collage that I think we really get a new way of understanding the play. So the play is taking bits from all over the place and forcing them together. And we see that played out literally in Hannah Cleel's production. It also foregrounds things that are really interesting but can be overlooked, sometimes in his historical productions and sometimes in the play itself, which are, ideas of identity, especially for Catherine. So there's a real dismissal of Catherine throughout the play because she is not English. So it's this implication that she maybe needs her trial to take place in Latin because her English isn't good enough, to which she says, well, I've been queen here for 20 years, so I'm not sure what that's about. And I would recommend, I think the Globe still have a webinar bit like this sort of format where Hannah Clear's talking about the idea of race and metaphors of darkness in that play. And I think it's a really, really interesting one to watch if anyone wants to spend another evening thinking about the play. That's certainly a link that maybe we can pass on, but that's a really good example of the play's other fears about identity and power and where that power should lie.
Brilliant. And that maybe takes us just to spend a few minutes on, as always, I've asked Laura if she would, as I always do, to pick out just a speech or a couple of speeches to talk us through so that we don't spend all the webinar sort of talking about or above or across the play, really. We have a little bit of, just a tiny bit of time with its detail. And I'm just going to, you'd think I would have got a bit better at this by now, wouldn't you? But no, absolutely not. No, that doesn't look like anything like what I want. Here we are. Let's do this now. Show. Here we are. Sorry about that. Great. I think this is the bit that you chose, Laura. Talk us through where we are and what you wanted to point out about this particular small section.
So, in this moment, Catherine is being told by Griffith, who is something between a kind of messenger role and a servant role. He has come to Catherine and has said, amongst other things, that Wolsey, Catherine's great enemy, has died. Um, and so we get Catherine's response to that. Interesting as well to note that that's happened off stage. So actually, this is the moment where we really kind of find out what's happened. But we also get a conversation between Catherine and Griffith that I think is important because it's indicative of the rest of the play in that the play is often structured around conversations between minor nobles. Sometimes there are crowd scenes. There are lots of voices here that aren't just the very, very main historical figures. So that's another thing I wanted to point out that actually we have a non-royal voice here on stage talking about what's happened in history. It's also a really good example of how the play shows perhaps unexpected moments of redemption, forgiveness. Catherine hears about the loss of Wolsey and gives a kind of reasonable summary of him, one that does create space for forgiveness. So here she says at the beginning of the speech, give me leave to speak him in with charity. So she's describing who he was. He was a man who ranked himself with princes. His opinion was his law. Um, he would say untruths and be double with his words and meaning. And his promises were mighty, but his performance nothing. So he was happy to, promise the world, but not actually do anything about it. So you get this incredibly damning sense of Wolsey, especially around this question of what is true. The whole play is kind of central concern. But then we also get a counter argument, exactly as we always do at every moment of this play, where Griffith then says, "May I now speak is good?" And Catherine says, "Yes." And she means that quite sincerely. So there is space to talk about the fact that Wolsey is um, ambitious and brave and learned and um, reckless, but in a maybe a kind of fantastic way. So the play shows in real time how someone's legacy is shaped, how people remember each other, how they pick different attributes and aspects, and this all sort of solidifies in this sort of um, not quite couplet, sort of memorable phrase from Griffith. He says, "Men's evil manners live in brass, their virtues we write in water." And this is often the line pulled from the text to advertise productions of it as a kind of summary of what happens. So everything men do that is wrong. We carve down forever, and we remember, and we never let it go, and their virtues just dissipate, and
Mm.
we don't pay any attention to them. So in some ways, that's a kind of challenge that the play puts forward. What do we remember? Why do we remember it? Can we be generous to powerful people around us? How do we sort of shape our sense of the dead? So I really love this exchange,
Mm.
and also, of course, this comes quite soon before Catherine will also die and have her own legacy shaped. So that's in the background as well. How will Catherine be remembered? Should she be generous in remembering her enemies in the hope that they might be generous in remembering her?
Mm. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing that. I think we're going to move just shortly to questions. Um, what do you feel I've missed out, Laura? What should we have? What haven't we spent time on? Do you think that we should have done?
I mean, one thing I think that it's worth stressing is this play is also a lot of fun. There's a lot of there's party scenes, there's sort of big there's banquets, there's we talked a little bit about spectacle,
Mm.
um, and you get a real contrast in this play between really small intimate moments. For instance, we have a moment where Henry is unwilling to play cards. He's very upset. He doesn't want to talk, and we see this sense that he's sort of in turmoil about his decision with Catherine. Then we'll jump back into a great big sort of court scene, and there's a sort of a real fluctuation between these two types of scene, which I think makes the play very watchable, very interesting. Um, the other thing that I think we've missed out is Cranmer. We've completely omitted
Yes. Okay.
the sort of Protestant power in the play. So Wolsey is gone from the play really by about halfway through. He sort of uh, falls from power, and he's such a presence in the first half of the play that there's this real sort of power void. And this is quickly replaced by Cranmer, who tries to sort of get in with Henry, manipulate Henry, at some point sort of prove his loyalty to Henry. There's a sort of bit of a palaver, really, a bit of complicated stage business with a ring that's used to prove Henry's loyalty or otherwise. But that being omitted, I think, is in some ways really fascinating because that's the bit of the play that everyone seems less interested in. It's a bit like the play runs out of steam itself. So suddenly, when we no longer have Wolsey and we have less of Catherine's power and less of Henry and Anne, and the play tries to get into the nitty-gritty of a kind of Protestant rising power and what the Reformation means, it does sort of lose its momentum. So
Mm.
this wonderful spectacle
Mm.
sort of yeah, it kind of boils out. So us not really talking about Cranmer is maybe exactly what we should do. It's exactly how to respond to that bit, I think. Except, of course, I should stress he is the oracle at the end of the play who predicts the power of Elizabeth and the rise of James. So I'm not saying he's unimportant, but certainly those scenes are probably less memorable than Wolsey's.
Mm. Brilliant, brilliant. Um, let's pick up some of the questions that people have asked. I think I want to start with Shabanka's point about the prologue and the epilogue. He points out brilliantly, Henry VIII is one of only three Shakespeare plays that has a prologue and an epilogue, and the only history play with both of them. Um, it what's happening with that framing? Is there is you know is it he says, is it ostensibly hermetically sealed off, but in reality anything but? I thought it was a really interesting thing to bring out. This the introduction to the play in the prologue. I come no more to make you laugh, things that bear a weighty and serious brow, high, sad, high and working, full of state and woe, such noble scenes as court draw the eye to flow, we now present. Um, what do you think? What would you want to say about that, those elements?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it, in that the prologue and the epilogue do purport to frame the play and to give us a direction about how to understand it. So the prologue we might understand as giving us a kind of generic hint. It's saying this is going to be very serious. This may be emotionally moving. This isn't going to be the history of bangs and battles that we might associate with, Henry V. But
Mm,
at the same time, uh, it's um, it's going to be slower and softer, and you're going to need to think more. That's not necessarily proved true in the course of the play. There are sorrowful moments, and there are certainly lots of emotive death scenes. But whether we can think the prologue is a sort of perfect introduction, I'm not sure. We then get the epilogue, which is even more complicated. So the epilogue talks about the one good woman of the play, which is another way that the play is kind of compelling us to look backwards and think, who was that?
mm,
Was that the Protestant Anne, or was that the Catholic Catherine? Um, and I would say that the play quite strongly suggests that the good woman here is Catherine, and that she has all the kind of markers of a virtuous wife, including a loyalty to her husband that is unwavering even after their divorce. So she continues to sort of bless him and wish him well, and stay loyal to him. But it certainly does end with this question mark, what are you going to make of this play? So the two pieces are very important, but I completely agree that it doesn't seal the play off. It doesn't let us enter and let us leave with clear instructions and answers. The two pieces are really complicated, and some directors have made that even more so by changing who speaks which lines. So if the actor playing Anne delivers the epilogue, and that sort of brings her back into prominence, although the play has sort of pulled her away, or if um, actors who've played noblemen can come forward and give that a sort of give the less powerful voice, the less royal voice, a moment. So yeah, I agree they're completely fascinating, but I don't think that they're meant to be answers.
mm, mm. Great. I like this question from Sarah. How does the fact that this is near contemporary history affect how Shakespeare's audience would have viewed it? I'm really glad you asked that, Sarah, because I'm always saying about the other history plays, look, you're sort of acting as if, 200 years ago is just all in the memory. The medieval history plays that Shakespeare writes, people didn't know uh, all that history. It was not within anything like living memory, but this is a little bit different. And then she goes on to say, when people today criticize factual inaccuracies in, for example, The Crown, they can't see it for the drama that it is. Um, I often point out they don't nitpick Shakespeare's Macbeth, they accept it as an expression of his art. But that is interesting to think whether the proximity of these events made their how that changes their depiction. It's a different kind of history, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think we can assume that audience members know what should be in the gaps. So know Henry will go on to have more wives, know that Anne Boleyn's reputation over the last sort of 80 years or so has been as a witch and a betrayer, and that these things are relatively familiar. Um, and the play tries to do that. It tries to touch its present moment. It tries to make that connection by pointing to James and saying, really, this is only a couple of generations ago. This is, grandparents, right? This is Elizabeth and then Henry. This is really not so far back. And I think it does help people to understand that idea of shaping history because it's all still up for play. It's kind of there's still space for people to interpret. Whereas, as you say, audiences who don't know the ins and outs of a succession crisis from, centuries ago might not be able to go, oh, that's an interesting way of framing it, or oh, did it really happen quite like that? So I think the the closeness of the play allows for your average playgoer, your average audience member to maybe see the workings a bit more clearly, kind of see the scaffolding, right? How it's put together and how it might not be true. Also, how the past itself might, I suppose, not seem so far away. How these moments that have completely shaped the course of your life, if you're standing in the globe, because of your nation's religious persuasion, its politics, it really wasn't that long ago. So these
Mm,
fundamental shifts that seem, unchangeable were really just a couple of generations back. You could and all of that could happen again. You could shift in a completely different direction. Um, so yeah, I think the play's interest in its connection to the present makes it unique among the history plays.
mm,
Not that the other histories never ever talk about the present moment, but this one is a bit more explicit.
mm, mm. I've got a couple of questions about topical resonances. Um, one, this is Elizabeth Calvario, reminds us about Steve Somer, who is brilliant on these calendrical things, isn't he? Suggested that the performance of Henry VIII on 29th of June, the feast of the Pope, was significant in that it echoed the king's historical break with the church, asking how significant does that feel, which is really interesting. Thanks for that question. And then Stephen uh, Watkins, hi Stephen. Stephen is our sort of champion questioner in many ways. Um, he's asking a really interesting about Henry, Prince of Wales. Does it relate not just to his death, but also the marriage negotiations that preceded it, with lots of Catholic princesses? The play does seem to want to assure us that Protestant princes can maintain their religious convictions even if they align themselves with Catholic spouses, although he says, of course, the play does undermine this through the divorce. So that was interesting about sort of forms of marriage, cross-religious marriage as well. So either of those, what would you like to say to either of those, Laura?
Well, firstly, the feast day is really fascinating, and I don't know a huge amount about that. So thank you for a start. I think that's just a really interesting point. We have other examples of plays that maybe are put on at pointed moments to sort of underscore their meaning. Certainly, to say that the play is anti-Catholic is complicated because of how interesting Catherine is and how sympathetic her character is. But it's clear that that sort of performance would just underscore the religious turmoil that is at the heart of the play. So the play is constantly talking about that kind of fraught break between a kind of Catholic, what seems like a Catholic past and a Protestant present. And that sort of performance would only underscore that. So yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. In terms of Henry, yes, there's an idea that princes can hold firm, but Henry is not the example of that. So Henry is, he describes himself as being sort of storm tossed. He's at sea. He doesn't know which way to turn. And certainly in terms of ending his marriage with Catherine, he says he's consulted various people. He's looked at, various books. he's making what appears to be an informed decision, but he's not sure. This is not a figure who is, confident, who is driven, who has any kind of divine inspiration about what he should do. This is someone who really seems to kind of be clutching at straws, and trying desperately to make a political choice that makes sense. So this isn't a monarch who's represented as being careful in his religion. He's not really acting because of faith. He's acting because of politics, because of what makes sense to keep himself in power. Um, so I think there's maybe a cautionary tale there. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, because Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was so forthcoming in his own kind of Protestantism, that was an important part of his iconography and the conversation around his potential marriage too. Um, I won't go into it too much now, but there's also interesting ideas of the performance of this play associated with the marriage ceremonies of James's daughter Elizabeth. So maybe that brings both those ideas together, the marriage and the sort of weighted performance dates. But as I say, that's maybe something to come back to
Mm,
another time.
really, really interesting. Um, Thanks for both those questions. Hey Wong, hi, hey. Does the breakdown of the rule of law, both civil and canon, ever get resolved within the play?
What an interesting way of putting that. I suppose resolution in this play is found in removal. So what happens is if someone is complicated, if their presence is difficult, then success is associated with getting them out of the way.
Mm.
So, is canon law resolved? Do we ever get a real sense of whether Henry is right to divorce Catherine, as this play puts it? No. But the play does get her out of the way with this vision that seems to redeem her. So, it seems to kind of tie that up with a knot. Um, the idea of civil unrest, the idea that people are not happy with Henry's rule is a bit more sort of under the surface. So the play begins with a dispute about taxes. People are very unhappy with having to pay taxes that Wolsey seems to be initiating. And Catherine is defending the people, saying that they shouldn't have to pay so much. But that dispute is really just used as a way to show Wolsey versus Catherine and not to get into the nitty-gritty of how people are coping and living, thriving, or otherwise under Henry. So there's a sort of a real sense in the play that there's an outside world where there are people paying taxes and consequences happening, and then there's a very small microclimate of the court. And that's where all the action's really taking place. So it's not really about resolution, and the play isn't very good at resolving things. It often picks up ideas and drops them again, uses them to make a point and then kind of forgets about them. So it isn't really a play with clear answers. Um, so for me, no, it resolves very little, and fixes very little and answers very few of its own questions.
Brilliant. I think we're about to probably come to an end. In a minute, Laura, I'm going to ask you. You already mentioned the Globe webinar on the play, but I'm just going to ask you if you've got any suggestions of things people might pick up to take this discussion further. It's not the easiest play to get to see, is it? Usually
Mhm.
we can say, oh, there's a great film or there's an NT Live or something. Have a look at that. We're not so easy on this, but it would be good to know about that. And while you're thinking of that, I'm just going to share my screen again and tell you about next the next upcoming webinars. We're really grateful that the English faculty at the University of Oxford has agreed to continue to support these, and so we'll be continuing to do these free during 2026. And that's just a heads up of what we'll be doing. As you know, the order of these is largely random. You can see my deft work with Henry VI parts 1 and 2, but otherwise it's largely random. It depends on when things were published. We're working through the whole canon in these new editions, and we haven't got to all of the plays yet, and also when people are available. But that's the spread for 2026. And just to let you know that next month, the first Monday in December, we will be talking about Romeo and Juliet with Hannah August. Brilliant, Laura. So do you have a suggestion about what you might get people to think about?
Yes, so I agree it's hard to see, in that it's not performed very often, but if you can, it's brilliant to watch online. So there are Globe productions through Globe Player, but there's also the adaptation that we talked about earlier. There is a Spanish language production that I think is really worth seeing, Enrique VIII, which was part of the Globe season. And that is a really wonderful one to watch because that obviously really plays with ideas of nationality, and certainly Catherine's role. So the first thing to do is see what you can find. In the introduction, I've talked about a few productions, a Canadian production and so on. They're all relatively accessible, but of course, it does sometimes require you to click around a bit and sometimes maybe get through a paywall. So do bear that in mind. Um, the other thing that I really enjoyed as part of this has been reading the accounts of different directors who've put this on. So I remember looking at Margaret Webster, for instance, who put on a version of this, and talked about it briefly. Talking reading about actors' experiences has been really fascinating, and that might be a path people want to go down. Um, the other thing I would say is putting this play against other versions of the kind of Henry VIII narrative from the period. So, for instance, there's Samuel Rowley's play, which basically does a similar reframing of this moment in history, but from the perspective of Edward VI being the kind of central heir. So instead of Elizabeth I being the one we focus on, we have basically the same kind of retelling, but with a very different ending. And that's the play When You See Me, You Know Me. So looking at other sort of Henry VIII moments is a really fascinating thing to do. But yeah, as I say, there aren't that many productions around, but the ones that there are very different and really, really valuable.
That's really great. Thank you. I have just pasted the list of the upcoming webinars in the chat, in the Q&A a couple of times. So I hope that that has answered that question for people wanting to plan ahead. Laura, thank you so much. This has been a genuinely revelatory conversation. You're so expert in this play, having worked on it dramaturgically as well as everything else. And I feel I've learned a lot from hearing you talk about it. I really want to see now a proper big, lavish production, lavish, clever production of it. So I'm just putting that out there in case anybody wants to pick it up. Thanks,
Absolutely.
everybody. Thanks for
Thank
being
you.
with us. Thanks, Laura. See you next time for Romeo and Juliet.